The tenon, half of the traditional mortise and tenon joint. It's reliable, it's strong, it's simple. If you want to make a joint like this, I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is it has to be pretty much perfect in order for it to work at all. The good news is perfection is totally within reach. You can do all of it on the table saw, and you don't have to buy a jig. Heck, you don't even have to build a jig. This is what we're aiming for. It's a tenon with clean, well-defined cheeks and very crisp, straight shoulder lines. This will go into a mortise really cleanly, and it'll seat straight along the edge. I've made this test mortise in a piece of scrap, and that's really important. Anytime you're doing power tool woodworking, you should make at least one, and sometimes 2 or 3 tests to make sure you've got your machinery dialed in perfectly. The first thing you need is perfectly square and straight stock to start with. You need to rip or joint both sides of the board, make sure the faces are flat, and you have to cross-cut the ends exactly perpendicular to the edges. It's really important that your component pieces be square along the edges and be square to both faces. But that's really easy to check. Just get it on the saw, bring in the rip fence, put it against the miter gauge, and push it against the rip fence. And you should see no gap over here. And then, this is the important part, flip it over. Set it against the miter gauge, push it against the fence, and check, and you should still see no gap, not even a little one. It's got to be a very tight fit. Flip the board around, and do it again. No gap, flip it, no gap. If you see that, then you're good to go, and you can start cutting your tenons. So now that my component is made and perfectly square, I want to cut the shoulder lines of my tenons. And the first thing I have to do is get the blade to the correct height to cut this line. What I did was just use my mortising gauge to gauge my mortise lines onto my tenon piece. It doesn't have to be exact, it just needs to be close, because it's going to tell me how high I need to raise the blade. I'm going to bring the blade up until it's just about at that line, or maybe even a little bit under. Then to cut the tenon, I'm going to set the fence as far away from the blade as I want my tenon to be high. In this case, my tenon's exactly 1 inch high, so I'm going to set the fence 1 inch away from the blade. Then I'm going to put my stock in the miter gauge and run it through. Now usually, it is completely not kosher to use the rip fence and the miter gauge at the same time. That's asking for kickback. But if you're not making a through cut, like we're not doing here, there's almost no chance of the piece getting bound up and kicking back. This is a generally accepted, safe practice, and you should be totally fine doing it. Now I said you don't need a jig to make tenons, and that's true, but it is very helpful to add one thing. This is just an auxiliary fence. It's a couple pieces of plywood and a couple of clamps. A lot of people use toggle clamps for these. Anything that's going to let you hold it flush is all that really matters. And all this does is it brings my fence up vertically, and it's going to allow me to hold my workpiece while keeping my hands a safe distance away from the blade. I've also made this longer than my fence, and sometimes I use it for jointing or getting edges on stuff. This isn't just for tenoning, I do a bunch of other things with it, so it's really worth the time to make. To set up the cut for your cheeks, you just need to bring the blade up until it intersects with the shoulder cut, and then bring your fence in until the blade is exactly perpendicular to that same shoulder cut. Try to leave the tenon a little bit fat, at least for the first time that you cut it. It's very easy to trim it smaller later on, and you really want to sneak up on a perfect fit. To cut the tenon cheeks, I put the board on end, give it firm downward pressure with my right hand, and push the piece into the fence with a tall push stick that keeps my hands far away from the blade. Once I've cut one side, I just flip and repeat. Now I should point out that this is kind of an advanced technique. You shouldn't do this if you're not experienced with your table saw. If you look at this and it makes you uncomfortable, don't do it. Get a jig. Once I've cut my tenon cheeks, I test it in my mortise. And this tenon is too fat, and that's good because I want to bring it in slowly to the correct dimension. I bring the fence in the tiniest amount I can. Because you're cutting this piece on both sides, any fence adjustment you make is doubled. So you want to bring it in the smallest amount you can, Run the cheeks through again, and then give it another test. This way you sneak up on the perfect fit. This is a good example of what the finished piece will look like. Now you can see here I've actually made the shoulder cuts a little bit deeper than the cheeks, and that's a good technique. Undercutting them a tiny bit like this will give you a tighter fit against the shoulders and a place for extra glue to go. So if your shoulder cuts are a little bit deeper than your cheeks, that's a good thing, and you can leave it like that. With this piece, I ended up having to make 2 more cuts, bringing the tenon width down a little bit each time. But after I did that, I had a beautiful, tight fit, and it goes right into the mortise just the way I want it to. Now once you've got your test tenon done, don't throw it away, save it, because you can use it to get your saw settings back anytime you want to. Just put your test piece against the saw and then adjust the blade and the fence to fit the piece. There's no measuring or marking necessary here because all the measurements are built into the piece you've already made. When I'm doing stuff like this, I usually batch cut my tenons. So I'll set the saw up for the shoulders, cut all the shoulders, then use my test piece to reset for the cheek cuts and do all of those. Using this technique lets me batch out a lot of pieces quickly. I could do several dozen of them in an hour if I had to, and they'd all come out exactly the same. Hey, I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, you might consider going to patreon.com/RexKruger and becoming a supporter of this channel. By doing that, you'll get early access to all of my videos, and you'll get exclusive content. For instance, this month I finally finished building and delivered a massive 11-foot by 7-foot display case with raised panel doors, built-in custom drawers, cubbies, glass shelves, crown molding. It was an enormous project and really a huge step for my fabrication business. I'm not making a video about this project, but I did do a series of blog posts about it on my Patreon page, and those are only available to my patrons. And I really want to thank my new patrons: Chris Evans, Dennis Lundbland, Paul Brooks, and Carl Pontney. By signing up to become patrons, they get early access to all of my videos and they get access to the exclusive content. So if you have a couple extra dollars, please consider becoming a supporter of this channel. My patrons are what make these videos possible. And my viewers are really important to me too. So even if you aren't a patron, thanks very much for watching.